Hello and welcome to the Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores big issues and ideas in a conversational way.
My name is Lily Mott.
I'm Sid Kodapati.
And I'm Tom Spare.
So in today's episode, we're looking at political news from around the world. We're going to be focusing on Serbia, Turkey, and Canada.
You might be wondering why we're not talking about the two T's, Trump and tariffs.
We thought we'd give your eardrums a rest from these two things, although the Canadian elections are very much being shaped by Trump's actions south of the border. But before we do that, we want to focus on Serbia. Sib, could you give us a bit of a background on the country itself?
Thanks, Tom. Yes, Serbia is a country in Southeast Europe with a population of around 7 million. Once a part of the former Yugoslavia, Serbia has long sat at the crossroads of East and West, balancing its ties with Russia, the EU, and the neighboring Balkan states. In recent months, however, a wave of protests has swept the country, led by students and opposition groups, and fueled by growing frustration with the government's grip on power.
To help us unpack what's happening and why it matters, we spoke to Vujo Ilic, a political scientist and researcher at the University of Belgrade. Vujo explains what triggered the protests, how the student movement is shaping the conversation, and what all this could mean for Serbia's relationship with the European Union.
Hi, my name is Vujo. I'm a political scientist at the University of Belgrade Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, and I will be talking briefly about what is currently happening in Serbia. Everything started on November 1st last year when a canopy fell at the train station in Novi Sad, killing 16 people. This happened in broad daylight. There could have been much more victims, actually, considering how often this train station is used. And also the building that houses the train station. It's a large modernist building from the mid-20th century, which is iconic for the city of Novi Sad. But what really mattered here was that the train station was in a process of being renovated, a part of a larger construction project funded by China through its Belt and Road initiative. It was actually ceremonially opened not once but twice by the officials at the opportune moments during their political campaigns. And all of this actually opened a lot of questions about the transparency of the deal, about potentially inflated prices and the quality of the work behind this construction project. So everything is related to questions of corruption and accountability. However, if we rewind everything a little bit, there have been protests in Serbia almost every year since 2016. So you may ask what's different about this. And honestly, it's hard to explain. Some people are explaining this in terms of a value shift or a generational change. In any case, some threshold seems to have been passed after so many years of almost regular protests. I think what really triggered people is the realization that corruption literally kills and that the lack of accountability cannot be tolerated anymore. There have been 6 months of protests, of mass protests and civic disobedience, which is the longest period of protest that Serbia has had. In scale, there have been hundreds of protests in practically all cities and towns across the country. And in Belgrade, the central protest on March 15th gathered some 300,000 people, which is the largest protest we ever had. And behind everything is a very strong social movement, which is led by students and their demands from November last year that have to do with accountability for what happened and for on November 1st and what happened in the days and weeks after that. Now, the students are an unlikely actor to be honest. We knew from different research on youth engagement that youth in Serbia is anti-authoritarian, especially compared to older generations, but also not politically engaged. So there were no high expectations of political mobilization coming from the students and the youth in general. But when on November 22nd, so some 3 weeks after the event in Novi Sad, students in Belgrade blocked the street in protest, they were attacked, as it turned out, by the members of the ruling party. And after that, they decided to occupy the universities. Serbia has 4 large university centers. Belgrade is, of course, the largest. And inside all of these universities and most of the faculties at them, students have been occupying the university buildings, organizing assemblies. So they're practicing direct democracy, coordinating amongst themselves and exporting the models to citizens and other groups. They are very horizontal. They have no central leadership, and they are taking a lot of effort to avoid accumulation of power in individuals. So far, they have been cooperating with social groups such as teachers, farmers, lawyers, but they have been distancing themselves from civil society organizations and political parties. The political opposition has been at the tail of events for a while, and there are several reasons for that. The opposition in Serbia is very heterogeneous. They are internally divided, and they have been through too many defeats in elections in the last decade. They are also being vilified in the government-friendly media for a decade and they have much less resources than the ruling parties. The opposition parties on the center and the left of political spectrum have created a coalition in 2023 elections and made quite significant results, but then split afterwards, divided amongst themselves again between participating or boycotting the elections in Serbia. So there is always a lot of new faces in the opposition parties. There is no clear leader, not because they don't want it necessarily, but because all opposition parties are in single digits when it comes to support among the voters, and there is no major party that can take the lead. When it comes to government, the key actor here is Aleksandar Vučić, who has centralized power since 2014 when he was first elected as a prime minister and then as a president since 2017. Vučić controls the media landscape, controls the public resources in the country, and has been organizing increasingly unfair elections, with the lowest point in 2023 when the level of fraud was really the highest ever recorded in the last 25 years. Vučić is also internationally balancing between the EU and the Eastern allies. And in this particular case of protests, he basically has support from all sides, from Moscow to United States and from the major EU countries and China. In January, after a particularly violent event against the students, the prime minister has resigned, and the new prime minister, who should form the government in a couple of days, actually, was selected from deep anonymity, and almost nobody in Serbia knew who that was. The support for the student movement in the population has been the largest challenge Vučić has ever had. His support base is stable, but it probably shrunk to some extent, and probably around 1/3 of the population supports him. But given the state of the opposition that I already described, this cannot really translate to electoral defeat yet. However, Vučić cannot find a solution for the student protest movement. He has been trying carrots for a while and is turning to sticks. And on March 15th, protest in Belgrade, the stick was in a form of a potential use of sound weapon against the protesters, which caused a lot of alarm among the citizens in Serbia. What is currently at stake, both in Serbia and from an international perspective? In Serbia, high schools and universities, both students and teachers, are at the front of this struggle. Economically, the livelihoods of school teachers who have been striking for months now are really at the low level, and there have been lots of mechanisms of solidarity being formed by the citizens to help the teachers. Students have been blocking or occupying the university, which means that there was no teaching for months now. And it may happen that the whole academic year could be lost in Serbia, while the faculty or the staff has not been paid for some time now. The government is now using multiple ways to target the universities who have mostly sided with the student demands. And that means that universities are at risk. It's really hard to predict what will happen in the future and if universities will be able to maintain autonomy. But right now, universities, together with civil society and media, are being particularly vulnerable to this in this wake of student protests. From the international perspective, this has been one of the largest, or not the largest, mobilization for democracy in Europe in the last year, and also in global terms, it has been very large. This is important because it also happens in a country with a declining quality of democracy for more than a decade, which is formally a candidate for EU membership, but whose approximation to EU has been stagnating for years, primarily because of the issues of rule of law and fundamental freedoms. And so in such circumstances, you would expect that there would be support from the EU, which is the largest promoter of democracy in the region, to the protesters in Serbia, but this has been lacking so far. I think that the credibility of the EU is gradually declining, and after this, it will be hard to say if there are any advocates of EU left in the country. So that's what's at stake when it comes to Serbia and its relations to the EU. The social movement in Serbia may be showing us that there is a new or different way to oppose authoritarian governments in the region. It may be useful to look more closely to the methods the students are using, to its horizontality, to the ways that it's protecting its autonomy. However, there are reasonable questions whether it can travel to other contexts or should it be replicated. I'm saying this because there are a lot of protests from Slovakia to Turkey and everywhere in between practically, which are making some people speak about Balkan Spring or Southeast European Spring. And it's not the first time in the last couple of years. And true, there may be some commonalities, but I also think that Serbia stands out a little bit because of the depth of the crisis of the institutions of representative democracy. There may be countries which are more authoritarian than Serbia in the region, but when it comes to citizens who are pro-democracy, they are especially skeptical in Serbia of the institutions of representative democracy, from political parties to the parliament and elections. So I think that's the context in which we should understand this big social movement that is resting on the instruments of direct democracy and is basically saying no to the kind of thinking about democracy that we had so far. It may be offering something new, but it may also be risking perhaps the only instruments that democracy can be returned to Serbia. If you feel like further reading, there is quite good analysis called The Future of the Protests and Democracy in Serbia, published by BIEPAG, the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, from mid-February, which means that it's 2 months old, but it's still quite good in describing the events in Serbia, its relation to democracy, and the relation with EU.
A big thank you to Vuyo for giving us that really concise and insightful overview of what's going on in Serbia. And also, thank you to the Central European University for letting us talk to Vuyo on this subject.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because we don't really hear much about Serbian politics or don't really know the history of it. So I'm looking forward to speaking to Vuyo in greater depth about the political history. It's interesting that Serbia seems to balance, the current government seems to balance its relationships very well between America, the EU, and Russia as well. So it sort of works in all those different spaces and all those different worlds in many ways. Also, it's interesting that the student movement is playing a really significant part in leading the sort of opposition to the government forces in Serbia. And he did reference in the clip, I don't know if you saw it, but they used this like air cannon thing, like not air, but I don't know what it was exactly, but it basically like parted like thousands of people. It's like a sonic, I don't know what it was, but it just sort of parted people. So you'd see this big crowd, and then suddenly loads of people at the back were looking quite scared, and then people just like moved across the street. So it's sort of this contrast between the power of the state versus sort of grassroots levels, because there isn't really very strong opposition parties. So young people are taking it upon themselves to sort of show resistance against government forces.
Absolutely, Tom. And I think it all started off with a canopy that actually broke down in one of the railway stations, to which various groups started protesting and demanding accountability and for cleaning up a corrupt system in a lot of the public works that they were doing. And what started from that has actually, over the last 6 months, has become one of the largest protests that has been seen in the history of Serbia. And that's something which is definitely to be taken note of by at least major news corporations, which often gets underreported. You'll probably see one of those clips on Instagram as a short reel where they will show the parting waves of the student protesters, and apparently there's alleged use of a sonic weapon, like you mentioned. While the presence of such thing is not yet confirmed, but inside reports are very few, and that's why it probably makes a lot of sense that when you have a professor kind of giving a clear insight into what's actually happening on the ground, it adds a lot of value to the news that's going out. Apart from that, I think it's the same, not to sort of trivialize the protests or the lives that have been lost over there, but the bottom line of the whole thing is that here are people trying to seek accountability from the government again, and the government's trying to use force, which is an age-old method which is never going to work. And you see a lot of that in a lot of these methods being used in East European countries throughout history.
Yeah, and the process size as well, I think, is about 300,000, which is amazing given the size of the population of Serbia is 7 million. So big chunk of the population. I'm hoping to arrange a more in-depth interview with Vuyo. I'm looking forward to having a sit-down conversation with him.
It's exciting. I'm excited to learn more about Serbia as well. Next, we want to talk about the neighbor north of the US, Canada. They have gotten lots of news coverage, a lot of news coverage for Canada over the last few months. Tom, could you give us an overview of what's going on in Canada at the moment? Unfortunately, Trump has really turned a lot of the news cycle on them, threatening to take over their sovereignty. But we're not going there. So, anyways, Tom, go for it.
He still has that allure to start talking.
Two T's.
Yeah, we need to have some sort of like a swear jar. Just, if we mention the two T's, we have to put a pound in every time into a joint account. Yeah, so in a remarkable turnaround, Canada's Liberal Party, under the leadership of the new Prime Minister Mark Carney, has experienced an unprecedented surge in public support, now holding an 83% chance of winning the upcoming federal election. So this is a dramatic shift because it began with the resignation of the former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on January the 6th of this year, 2025, amid declining approval ratings and internal party divisions. Trudeau's departure paved the way for Mark Carney, a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. And it is worth bearing in mind that Mark Carney's never held public office before, but he's been an official, but he's never been a politician. To enter the political arena, Carney was elected as the Liberal Party leader on the 9th of March, securing an 85.9% of the vote, which is pretty comprehensive. And he was sworn in as Prime Minister on March the 14th. Carney's leadership comes at a time of heightened tensions with the United States. President Donald Trump's administration imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian goods not covered by the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, excluding Canada from a 90-day tariff reprieve granted to other nations. In response, Carney implemented a reciprocal tariff on US vehicle imports and established a $2 billion strategic response fund to support affected Canadian workers. Also, in the lead up to this, a lot of Canadians have stopped traveling to America, like holidays. They're boycotting American goods. They're not doing as much open trade as well. So Canadians have sort of really been brought together by this. So the Liberal Party's resurgence and election outlook, initially trailing the Conservative Party by 20 points, the Liberals' fortunes have reversed following Carney's accession and his assertive stance against US trade policies. The party's resurgence is attributed to Carney's economic expertise and his perceived ability to navigate the challenges posed by Trump's administration. An Ipsos Mori poll indicates that Canadians view Carney as the best candidate to confront these external threats, with the federal election scheduled for April 28th. The Liberal Party's remarkable polling surge positions them favourably to secure a renewed mandate. As Canada approaches this pivotal election, the outcome will significantly influence the nation's approach to international trade and its response to ongoing geopolitical pressures. Guys, what are your thoughts on the situation in Canada? Because 20 points is where the Conservative Party in the UK was at the 2024 general election, and they stayed on that, and they'd stayed on 20 points behind Labour for months leading up to that. So the idea of that being turned around is pretty remarkable.
I will say I don't know as much about where the Canadian political parties fall on the general spectrum between Labour, Conservative, Democrat, Republicans. I'm not as well versed in that. I think it's interesting that Canadians are choosing a Liberal party and a Liberal candidate in general rather than Conservative at this time, where not the rest of the world, but a significant portion of the world is choosing to be much more insular and much more nationalist and protective of their own resources. I think it's interesting that Mark Carney's ascension in especially just the recent, how long did you say it was, Tom?
So Trudeau resigned in January, and he only got into post in mid-March.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's just so interesting that isn't kind of what the nation's calling for, rather than more nationalism, because I do think that's the way that a lot of countries are reacting. They're just being a lot more protective of themselves. And I think it's just interesting to me, like the basic differences between liberals and conservatives.
And one thing to add, the first countries that Carney went to for his as prime minister he went straight to Europe. So he was just making that clear indication that, Europe is where that partnership is. He met with Macron. They went to Downing Street. I think he met the King as well. So yeah, he was given the welcome treatment. And yeah, I mean, I've always been sort of quite impressed by Carney. I know he made a big name for himself. He was the first non-British governor of the Bank of England in Bank of England's history. And then he, not long before he left the post, he intervened in Brexit as well and said what sort of damage that could do. And that really annoyed, obviously, a lot of the Leave camp, because they also then used it as a way of saying, well, yeah, it's just a group of elites that are controlling things. Yeah, so it's quite an interesting thing that they've gone for a very technocratic leader. I don't know how well he will do post this sort of Trump wave. So once he starts governing, will that sort of fall apart a bit? Will that bump a bit like the Conservatives had in 2019? Will it just sort of fall apart once they get back into governing? Because Trudeau was prime minister for nearly 10 years. So it's not like this party, hasn't been around for a while. But I mean, Trudeau was walking wounded for a very long time politically. So I'm surprised he lasts this long anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you on all those points. And I just want to make a couple of more points to that. I think the change in Canada came at the perfect time. If Trudeau was facing off against Trump right now on tariffs, the Conservative Party in Canada would have won hands down. Poilievre, if that's the pronunciation, would have won hands down. And Carney has actually done really well in terms of his messaging and his narrative that he's put out. He's actually been very curt and very, very straightforward with the whole thing. And he's not sounded rude, which is probably the Canadian way of, being or saying something which is very serious. And that's great. And he's taken like really bold steps where he's his first international trip, like you mentioned, his state visit or official visit was to Europe and not to the United States, which it has always been, I guess, for many, many years. And all of this has actually bumped up his ratings a lot and his chances a lot, not just in specific sections of Canada, but also in Quebec as well, which is known to have a very strong sort of nationalistic sort of perspective over there of Quebec having its own identity and so on and so forth. So yeah, apparently an Ipsos poll, which was done very recently, shows that he has the Liberal Party's got a 12-point surge ahead of the Conservative Party, and that's pretty big. And after that, there's a party. I think it's a National Development or New Development Party, if I'm not wrong, led by Jagmeet Singh, which has 10%. So it'll be difficult for the Conservatives to kind of claw back on this unless there's like some sort of a poor compromise that's made on the tariffs, which is not going to bode well. So him calling for snap elections at this point in time is absolutely perfect politics. So that's my take on it. So we've talked about Serbia and Canada. Lily, can you tell us what's going on in Turkey?
Absolutely. And I will start off by warning everyone about my pronunciations. I'm going to do my best and we'll see how it goes. So, Turkey is currently experiencing significant political turmoil, and this has really, I think, some of the other stories that we've talked about, this one I think is drastically underreported, especially the history behind a lot of what's going on. Very underreported. So I'm glad that we're talking about it. There have been widespread protests, a government crackdown on dissent, and complex international relations. And so we'll go back a little bit and talk about the history behind some of this. recent history, but the history behind the current events that we're going to be talking about. Turkey has played a pivotal role in reshaping the power dynamics of the Middle East by supporting Syrian rebel factions, notably Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I'll refer to it as HTS. And this backing was instrumental in the December 2024 overthrow of President Bashar al-Assad's regime. And this was covered. I think that this was, of course, a huge moment in the Middle East. And following Assad's departure, Ahmed al-Shara, the leader of HTS, assumed the presidency of Syria. And it was interesting too, even like on the BBC, I remember seeing people in the streets when this happened, and there was, all of these parties going on and things. That was covered, that moment. In the wake of these significant foreign policy developments, Turkey is currently grappling with substantial domestic political challenges. The arrest of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu on corruption charges in March 2025 has ignited nationwide protests, with critics alleging that the charges are politically motivated. The government's stringent response, including mass detentions, has drawn international concern over the state of democracy and press freedom in Turkey. These internal challenges, coupled with its assertive foreign policy, place Turkey at a critical juncture, and they're having to navigate both domestic dissent and the country's role in a rapidly shifting regional landscape as the Middle East continues to change. Turkey has always been a really prominent force in that, but I think especially now, İmamoğlu's arrest has ignited nationwide protests with hundreds of thousands participating, including a significant number of university students, which I actually was going to bring up when we were talking about Serbia, because I think we're just seeing an incredible amount of student protests around the world. And I think both of these cases that we're talking about today are examples of how instrumental students have been throughout history, and especially when it comes to political history and political moments. So often students have led movements and protests, and so I'm really glad that we're highlighting two of them. I think we could even talk a little bit about the protests that are happening in the US as well, and it's a scary and very interesting time to be a student on a college campus around the world. So I think the government has responded with a heavy hand to these protests, detaining nearly 2,000 individuals and jailing approximately 300 pending trials. Despite the crackdown, the CHP has pledged to continue weekly demonstrations and is calling for early elections, asserting that the current administration's actions undermine democratic institutions. And at the same time that these protests are happening, and in a move that raised further concerns about the freedom of press, Turkish authorities detained two leading journalists on charges their newspapers claim are retaliatory and linked to their investigative reporting. These arrests have been condemned by media watchdogs and opposition leaders as attempts to silence government critics. Members of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee have recommended Turkey's EU accession process remain frozen due to the continued deterioration of democratic standards, particularly highlighting the politically motivated removal of İmamoğlu. And then I think as we consider the domestic unrest, Turkey is engaged in technical talks with Israel. They're establishing a de-escalation mechanism in Syria, aiming to prevent accidental military clashes. This dialogue reflects the complex regional dynamics and Turkey's strategic interests, even as it faces internal challenges. These developments represent a very turbulent period for Turkey, I think are also representative of the wider turbulent period in the Middle East, and there are significant implications for both domestic stability, democratic institutions, and international relationships. So yeah, what are your guys' thoughts?
As well as the protest angle, it's this interesting parallel between like Serbia's role in its relationships with other countries is very solid, but it has its own insecurities internally. So the political machinations that are going on externally are being managed pretty well, but internally there's all that disruption. So yeah, it's sort of there's interesting parallels there, and also it's Turkey's becoming more and more prominent in regional discussions, but also like, for example, with being a mediator with Ukraine as well. So Russia's sort of position with Syria has fallen away. They're now focusing pretty much solely on Ukraine. So this gives sort of Turkey an opportunity to have a bit more free reign. But the domestic issues that are going on, that could start to unravel at any moment, because historically, Turkey's had a long history of military uprisings, of governments that are unpopular being overturned by the military. And Erdogan has really sort of doubled down on his strength and power in the country. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to see if these protests grow into anything larger to destabilize the country. And, Erdogan is sort of one of those sort of strong men, inverted commas, who's got quite a lot of staying power, so yeah, I'd be. I think we should probably keep an eye out for it, and I hope we can find maybe an expert in this sort of field to tell us a bit more about the shape of Turkey as well, where this sits in recent times, and if it's comparable to any other uprisings.
True, Tom. And to add on to that, like especially on Erdogan specifically, he's been practically in power since 2003. He was the Prime Minister of Turkey from 2003 to 2014. And then he becomes the President of Turkey, 2014 onwards. And then I think the term length of a president in Turkey changed after his first term got over. So he's basically consolidated power systematically. And the protests are primarily to deal with the fact that, he's becoming increasingly authoritarian. There's the country which had a far more secular ethos is now being diluted specifically by the administration. There have been specific attempts that have been made to dilute that, and so on and so forth. And so what I'm trying to say is that you have all of this boiling up. It's all building up to what has happened right now. And the people have been looking for one challenger who's probably the mayor of Istanbul, which is also the center for, for all activity in Turkey in a sense. And the fact that his rising popularity has caused a problem, and the fact that they've actually gone ahead and arrested him on various charges, some of which are simply absurd. Bribery and slander is just one of them, but there's also treason-oriented charges that have been put against him, which seems very odd that they suddenly popped up, but geopolitically, Turkey is a very important partner to the United States. They've helped them a lot in the battle against ISIS and its factions. Turkey's been more than helpful to use military resources in the northern sections of Iraq and sort of quell certain uprisings which have happened in the Levant region. And they've really gone ahead and done that. And I think they share a fairly good relationship with the current US administration as well. There's an article, there's a quote where the US president has asked Netanyahu to not take a tough stance against Turkey and kind of say that, he's a very smart man, be reasonable with him, and so on and so forth. Right? If you have the external support, then you will get some sort of funding which is wired through into the country to ensure that the person who is friendly towards a major power remains in power. But we'll have to see how these protests carry forward and how the government continues to react, or through force, and not just against protesters who are students primarily, but they're also clamping down on journalists. In fact, if BBC reported this after one of their journalists was detained and then deported back to the UK. So when these things start happening, I think then the world media's attention, especially European media's attention, suddenly starts, they start ringing alarm bells as to what's happening over there. So according to the stats, about 8 journalists have been detained so far. That is known. We don't know how many more. So we'll have to see how this thing unravels. It's only going to get worse, according to me.
So we've covered Serbia, Canada, and Turkey, and now for something closer to home. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about the event that you guys went to last week?
Yeah, so Sid and I were at the launch of New Wales. And here's Gwenville, who's the acting director of New Wales, explaining what New Wales is.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of New Wales is to have a new cross-party forum for discussing all of the things that we've discussed today, actually researching things. And in researching things, doing it far more broadly than existing think tanks and existing policy units in Wales might do, or policy units that are restricted because they're within the establishment. But we don't have a body that is willing to research things that you may never want to embrace, but you need to know what you're not doing as well as what you're doing to make a truly informed decision. And we don't necessarily do that. And the other thing we don't do is communicate the research more widely. And that's why I call it a think tank plus. The idea is that it doesn't just rely on talking within the bubble in Cardiff Bay, or talking to policymakers, or lobbying for policy change, or providing new policy ideas, which is a hugely important thing to do, and something which we do need to do. And we definitely need to do it outside the social policy sector. Well, there's a lot of work in the social policy sector in Wales. So the one area that I would say that New Wales probably won't engage with is the social policy area, because it's so comprehensively covered by a vast array of bodies in Wales. But we don't have people really doing the economic research. We don't have people doing the constitutional stuff. We don't have people doing energy and broadcasting. We don't have that persistent voice of doing those things, or of being willing to be controversial in looking at those things. Not even in the education sector. We don't really have anybody, pushing for innovation, genuine innovation in the education sector, even though Wales has centuries of tradition and history in innovating in education. And I would love to lead on that particular thing. You might have gathered that I've got an interest in education. And in an ideal scenario, we will secure some resources for New Wales as it evolves and grows. Another thing that we're very keen to do, and we have one of our sort of founder members is out in Canada. We're really hoping to engage the Welsh diaspora with this conversation, because, unlike other nations, I don't think Wales has historically been very good at engaging with its outside Wales Welsh population. Ireland and Scotland are actually pretty good at talking to Irish and Scottish diasporas and engaging with them and bringing funding and contributions from them. Whereas in Wales, we're not very good at that. So I'm hoping that Simon, who's out in Canada, he's out in Quebec, I'm hoping that he will be able to work through organizations like Global Welsh, who are already engaging with this diaspora, work with a wider array of people to have their voices contributing to that vision for Wales. And I have no doubt that for that Welsh diaspora, many of them in very different cultures, they'll have very different perceptions and visions for Wales than those which the current establishment in Wales might consider palatable or desirable. But having them express those and contribute those ideas might help give clarity to those within positions of power in Wales, where often at the moment there's woolliness in their thinking. And obviously, as you know, this is Wales, and the Welsh way of doing things is a certain way. I'm not going to be popular. New Wales isn't going to be popular, because this is not done in Wales. Sticking your head above the parapet and saying, well, sorry guys, what we're doing isn't good enough, is not popular in Wales. Coming in with the attitude of our fundamental core focus in New Wales is to ask the question, how can we do this better, is not a popular position. But I figure that I've already got a huge target on my back, so I may as well just make it bigger. Our starting point as well, constitutionally, just referring back, and I think we're explicit about this in our current About Us, is the conclusions that were put forward by the Constitutional Commission. In that sense, we're explicitly looking to build on where they've got us to, so that their report doesn't just lie on a shelf gathering dust.
And my thanks to Gwen for being interviewed for the other podcast I'm on, Spare a Thought. And you can listen to that episode in the show notes. So we attended that last week in the Senedd. It's a timely event as Welsh politics enters a period of major change. The event was chaired by Gwenville, acting director of New Wales, and included speeches by Leanne Wood, the former leader of Plaid Cymru, David Melding, former Conservative MS and member of the Senedd, and Federalist, and Paul Silk, who chaired the Silk Review of Welsh Devolution about a decade ago. Sid, what were your thoughts on attending the event?
First of all, I think it was a great event to attend and sort of get an insight into what politicians who were not as active as they were, or who were not, standing up for elections, think unitedly across the spectrum about what is good for Wales. That sort of unity is something which is missing these days. We don't get to really see that. And they pretty much all had the same thought process that what is it that Westminster has that is really important for Wales, and how does Westminster view Wales at this point in time? What are they planning for Wales? Why there is such a mismatch in terms of development or opportunities or welfare that's happening, and what the impact of Brexit has had on Wales, along with the Scottish referendum. There was multiple references to that, and I found the entire event quite insightful. I think the most important point, which I thought, the most important outcome, which I thought was extremely interesting, was the idea of soft culture being used as a soft power for Wales and increasing its relevance across the world as a nation, as well as to the outside world, and also to Westminster, which would actually make a big difference. Because the thought kept going on in my mind as to what's the bargaining chip here for Wales, or for the Senate, because you'll have higher representation. But does the higher representation mean, similar level of politics with more number of people elected to the Senate, or does it actually go ahead and change how they function? The focus, how does it function? Are they going to pitch for more devolution, and so on? So, yeah, I think it was a great event.
Yeah, and to add on to that, there was a discussion about the Welsh diaspora, so people living outside of Wales, and I think the number of people that live outside of Wales is the same number that live inside Wales. So there's like another 3.5 million people that live around the world that are part of that. And what role can they play? Because they gave the example, I think they gave the example like, so Paul Silk, for example, was saying he's done a lot of work in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. And the Irish are obviously very, very good at connecting with their diaspora, even like with elections and everything. There's always a key thing of come home to vote, or make sure you vote when you're abroad. But obviously, then there's this whole claim in America, for example, if you go to Boston or sort of cities like that, on St. Patrick's Day, everything's green, the water's green, the drinks are green, everything's green. So there's sort of like that strong identity. Whereas in Wales, Welsh people abroad probably aren't quite that way. You would know, you're probably more likely to bump into someone that's English or Scottish. Again, the Scots are really good at doing that sort of international piece. They're able to distinguish themselves from the rest of the UK. So that was a really interesting point. They were really talking down the union between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And many of them were making the prediction that in the next 30 to 40 years, the UK won't exist in the way that it does today. And the level of skepticism towards that took me by surprise. There's also this discussion going on around whether, there could be a second Scotland independence referendum in the next 10 years, but also there could be a referendum of England leaving the UK, which was an interesting point, driven potentially by reform. So, they were my sort of main reflections.
It's interesting that the launch of New Wales came at such a pivotal time, obviously, as 2026 looms and the Senedd election is coming, and it's going to be the most significant in Welsh history. I think living now in London, having moved from Cardiff and working in politics in London, it's been really interesting how often we talk about the upcoming election in Wales and Scotland. We're talking about it quite a lot. The number of members will rise from 60 to 96 with a new proportional electoral system, the closed list proportional system introduced to better reflect votes across Wales. The change addresses long-standing concerns about capacity and scrutiny, and it's expected to reshape how government and opposition function.
But as a Cavendish Cymru report released yesterday, that is 10th April, points out, the system change alone won't decide the outcome. The political context has actually shifted dramatically. Welsh Labour, in power since the Senate's inception, which was, if I'm not wrong, 1999, correct, is facing growing challenges, not just from Plaid Cymru and the Conservatives, but increasingly from Reform UK. The polling published this week in The Guardian suggests that Reform could overtake Labour in some parts of Wales. So therefore, according to the prediction that's been made by Cavendish Cymru, for the first time in Welsh history, a multi-party coalition government is not just likely, but seems to be inevitable.
The report also warns that the new closed list system could lead to a more polarised Senedd, as party candidates will be selected by members rather than the public. That could deepen divides on issues like the constitution, culture and the economy. As Wales looks towards a very different democratic future, the challenges for all parties will not be just how they campaign, but also how they cooperate. And if we sort of take a bit of a bird's eye view of that, a lot of the slide towards populist parties who provide simple solutions seemingly to very difficult problems is driven by traditional parties not being able to work together. So the United States is a good example of that, right? So you have this deepening divide between not even being able to pass the budget and very basic things like that, not being able to pass judges and vote on to pass legislation. And it might even be worth doing a future episode on this about how little legislation's been passed in the United States over the last sort of 20 years. And a lot of that's down to this sort of political divide. And from that sort of vacuum, that power vacuum, Reform can slide in and take a lot of votes. The thing is, Reform doesn't have a leader in Wales. All the other political parties do, but Reform doesn't. So it's not clear what the party sort of stands for in Wales. I think in early May, they've got a rally to sort of that they're going to put some sort of ideas out there, but it's not that clear. And actually, I attended the Cavendish Cymru event on LinkedIn earlier yesterday, and the journalist Will Hayward was talking about actually Nigel Farage could be a bit of a bogeyman in Wales during the elections because he's English, very English, and he wants to privatise the NHS. So there's that, and the NHS is a real sacred cow in Wales because it was a Welshman that led the creation of the NHS. There's this interesting contradiction. And also, Reform voters in Wales are actually relatively left-wing. They're not actually right-wing. So socially, in many ways, the Reform Party in Wales is more to the left than the party in England. And I think it's probably a similar tension that you get with Labour, UK Labour versus Welsh Labour. Welsh Labour has always been a bit more to the left than UK Labour.
I think that would be a really good topic for us to expand upon, especially as we get closer to the elections. I'm sure you guys will be going to some more events and things. So I think we could definitely do kind of a mini series as we get closer. Before we bring things to a close, we're going to end with our good news segment. And this one has gotten a lot of hype in the UK. In a rare boost for UK leisure and tourism, Universal Studios has announced plans to build the first European theme park and resort in Bedfordshire. In just a few years, you, your friends, and your family will be able to adventure through the worlds of James Bond, The Lord of the Rings, and Paddington Bear, all without leaving the UK.
Absolutely. And scheduled to open in 2031, that means 6 years from now, the 476-acre site near Kempston Hardwick will feature rides and experiences based on some of Britain's most iconic franchises, alongside favorites like Jurassic Park, Minions, and Back to the Future. Along with that, they will also have a 500-room hotel, shopping district, and entertainment complex, which are also in the works. The project is expected to create, and this is probably the most important thing, 28,000 jobs and add nearly 50 billion pounds to the UK economy by 2055. With plans for a new train station and major transport upgrades, the development aims to be as accessible as it is ambitious. Which basically means, Tom, that we need to buy our tickets today.
Yeah, we do. And I'm sure Shane is really up for it. And we're going to see it all over his social media. Shout out to Shane. He's very dedicated to the Labour Party and a former classmate of ours. I saw it on his Instagram. Hi, Shane. We love you, really. So that brings this episode to a close. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating or comment wherever you're listening. This has been a Be the Change Media production, edited by our very own Lily Mott.
Thanks for listening to the Political Dispatch.